The following program contains mature content about crimes involving rape, murder, and sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised.
Previously on Southern Nightmare.
Comparing names against each other, and all of a sudden, Timmy Spencer's name pops in my head. Everything just seems to fit the puzzle. The pieces are all coming together now.
It was already 10 in the morning, and lab tech Rena Chapouris was nowhere to be seen at the Medical College of Virginia's Department of Neurosurgery. Nobody knew where she was. And that just wasn't like Rena, says her boss at the time, Dr. Ronald Hayes, who was the director of MCV's neurosurgical research labs.
Well, what happened that morning was Rena didn't show up for work, so it was quite unusual. She was very reliable. She was close to one of the other technicians there. She tried to call her. She wasn't answering her phone. I guess it was around 10 or so, or 10:30. I got one of the technicians that was going by her house who knew where she lived, and she knew her boyfriend, so we went and got her boyfriend. Before we left, the technician in the lab was very distraught because she'd had dreams the night before that she'd been killed or something terrible had happened to her. And she was just rocking back and forth in the chair, very, very upset.
That morning, Wednesday, January 6, 1988, Dr. Hayes and the lab tech picked up Rena's boyfriend of 5 years, Jim Rushing, a bartender and musician. And then the three of them drove over to Rena's Grove Avenue apartment in Richmond's Fan District.
When we went up the stairs to her apartment door, it was ajar. So immediately, this was not normal.
We went in, and I went to the back bedroom, and the place was just a mess, like it had been turned out, like somebody had robbed. I went to the back bedroom, and I looked to where the door joined the wall, and I could see her body laying on the bed. And then I just told the guy, I can't go in there, and he did, and the look on his face. And I worked at a restaurant about a block away, and I just took off downstairs screaming.
And so her boyfriend started panicking, I guess. He started rocking back and forth, saying, oh my God, and nobody would go in. So I went in and saw the apartment, living room area in disarray. Obviously, it had been a scene of some, violent disturbance. What I saw was a bloody hammer or something that looked like that on the floor. I made myself go inside, of course, and I saw her on the bed, and I frankly can't remember what I saw. Really, it was not good, and so I just sort of, stumbled out of the bedroom, and we called the police.
The 29-year-old woman was lying face up on her bed, nude from the waist down. She had been beaten and strangled, and her hands were bound together with Venetian blind cords tied to one ankle. Local news reporters instantly began asking if this was another South Side Strangler murder, even though it took place on the other side of the James River, 3 to 4 miles away from the other killings.
So I slept basically with a screwdriver in my bed for the first couple of days because I thought it was a South Side Strangler too.
From True South Media in Richmond, Virginia, in cooperation with Style Weekly and WRIR 97.3 FM Richmond Independent Radio, this is Southern Nightmare, the story of how the South Side Strangler was brought to justice. I'm your host, Richard Foster. Rena Chapouris had reportedly been strangled with a pink sweater. Like Dr. Susan Helms, she had also worked at MCV's Department of Neurosurgery and was found stripped to the waist. And police would later learn that Rena worked part-time waiting tables at O'Toole's, a popular Southside restaurant and pub where Southside Strangler victims Dr. Helms and Debbie Davis had sometimes eaten. But to Richmond homicide detective Ray Williams' trained eye, there were enough differences between the murder scenes that it was obvious to him at first glance that the Rena Chapouris killing was either a copycat murder or someone trying to disguise it as the work of the Southside Strangler. For one thing, Williams says, Rena's hands were bound in front. More importantly, she hadn't been sexually assaulted. Also, she had been repeatedly beaten in the forehead with a blunt object. Early news reports said it was a hammer, but Ray Williams says it was actually a slapjack, a blackjack-style weapon with a hand strap. The killer left it behind on the bedroom nightstand, he says. Rena's bed was covered in blood spatter from the head wound, and her apartment had been thoroughly ransacked.
I knew, within 5 minutes. I said, we got a wannabe.
Over the years, a lot of rumors have grown up around the Rena Chapouris murder in Richmond, and the case has taken on a mythic quality. When I was a reporter at Style 20 years ago, someone called me with a tip, claiming that a cop had killed Rena, and that it was covered up. Since I started this podcast, I've had other people mention that same rumor to me. So far, I haven't been able to find any truth to it. Like a lot of things in life, the real facts in Rena Chapouris' murder seem to be a lot more prosaic. Hours after Chapouris' body was found, police responded to the suicide of Rena's former roommate, Michael St. Hilaire, about a mile away. A 28-year-old carpenter, St. Hilaire had hanged himself with a wire in the basement of a West Main Street coffee house where he had been living with his fiancée. St. Hilaire had struggled with cocaine addiction for years. Friends said he was self-medicating to deal with the pain from a gunshot wound he had suffered almost a decade earlier when he was driving an ice cream truck and a robber shot him in the lower spine. St. Hilaire had briefly dated Rena's older sister and best friend, Mariana Keller. Mariana says her sister Rena was a spiritual woman who loved her cats and traveling. But Rena was also very trusting and ran with a crowd that included some questionable characters, like Michael St. Hilaire. After Mariana broke up with him, St. Hilaire became roommates with Rena for a couple months until Rena kicked him out, Mariana says.
And Rena even called me before that and asked my opinion. Do you think it's okay? What do you know about Michael? Is it safe to let him rent a room here? And I said, well, this is where I occasionally have some guilt because I didn't know the extent of maybe Michael had a lot of darkness I didn't understand. I was naive, I think. I know I was naive about people taking drugs. So I did tell her, I said, well, he's kind of a loser in the fact that he cannot be stable, and I know he does drugs, but I don't think that would be harmful to you if he pays the rent. That's kind of his separate life. There was never any problem there, except the final straw of when there was a problem was there was, I think this was that money was stolen from her house, and she thinks Michael broke in because she kicked him out. Oh, that's right. Something was missing from her room, so she, I don't know if she assumed or knew that Michael did it. She just kicked him out, period. So he didn't stay there any longer. He was only there a month or two, maybe.
Police would later definitively declare that St. Hilaire had killed Rena, saying they had found matching fibers at the scenes of both Rena's murder and St. Hilaire's suicide. In recent years, there's been some debate about the accuracy of fiber analysis. It's definitely not as conclusive as DNA or even fingerprints. Police said that St. Hilaire's motive for killing Rena had been robbery. They cited a diary entry he left behind in which he said he needed money and was about to do something dangerous and might kill himself if he wasn't successful. Still, even today, not everyone is sure St. Hilaire was really the killer, including Rena's sister, Mariana. She says she was told by police that boot prints found on the bed didn't match St. Hilaire.
Yes, his fingerprints were in the house because he was a roommate there. So that still doesn't prove he strangled it. In my mind, and some of my close friends, we don't really know in our hearts if he did it. We know he was a good scapegoat because he hung himself, which he always threatened to do while he was dating me, before Rena. Oh, Mariana, life sucks. I almost killed myself in your basement today. In my basement. He said he would almost did that. And that's when I kicked him out. I said, I'm tired of this crap. You need to go fix yourself. Do not be telling me that.
One thing was clear, though. No matter who killed Rena Chapouris, the sight of yet another young woman brutally strangled to death had left Richmond homicide detective Glenn Williams depressed and dispirited. More than 3 months after the murder of Debbie Davis, he and his partner Ray still weren't any closer to catching the South Side Strangler, and Glenn had had enough.
It bothered him. He said, this is frustrating. I said, Glenn, we work hard, we'll get a break. I said, you make your own breaks in this thing. Just stay with me and we'll get it done. But he'd get real distant. He'd sit in the car, wouldn't say anything for an hour at a time. You have to be careful around cops that are quiet because they're internalizing a lot of that stuff.
Southern Nightmare will be back after this message.
So it's really good. Again, it is very kind of creepy and dark and sad. They do a really nice job of sort of profiling the victims. And so they sound like real humans and you really understand these people, which I think is a nice touch on these true crime podcasts because so often they kind of just like breeze by the people who were the victims.
And the other thing I really like about it is that knowing that there's this DNA thread that they catch the killer using DNA.
That's John and Sherry from the super popular DIY home decorating blog Young House Love. They gave Southern Nightmare a shout out on their Young House Love podcast, and we really appreciate it. John and Sherry are also based here in Richmond, and they are a phenomenon, seriously. They have over 200,000 social media followers. If you like cool home decor and do-it-yourself projects, go visit younghouselove.com. I also want to thank some of the new supporters who have contributed to our Southern Nightmare Patreon page recently. So this is a big thank y'all to Kaylor Wallace, Frank Stokes Jr., Marie Christopher, Christine Linker, Lauren Stegman, and last but not least, Jessica Smith. If just 10% of our listeners donated $5, we could start production on Season 2 of Southern Nightmare. Some listeners have sent us ideas for stories for Season 2, but we can't do that without your financial help. So please visit southernnightmare.com/donate, make a donation, and leave us your ideas for which cases we should feature in Season 2.
I am very hopeful it's going to have a very satisfying ending because sometimes these podcasts are like, where's Richard Simmons? And I listen for 10 weeks and they're like, he's around. Like, I need more of a tied up in a bow ending. I need closure. And I feel like that is coming for this podcast. And I appreciate that.
The break in the case the Williams boys had been looking for would come far sooner than they knew, however. Later that evening, the same day that Rena Chapouris' body was found, Ray and Glenn received a call from Arlington homicide detective Joe Horgus, who said he knew the name of the South Side Strangler, Timothy Spencer. Bullshit, Glenn replied. Horgus told them that Spencer had been jailed for breaking and entering into houses just after the 1984 murder of Carolyn Hom in Arlington, and he had been released to a halfway house for parolees in South Richmond just 2 weeks before the murder of Debbie Davis. Horgus had confirmed that Spencer had checked out of the halfway house during each of the murders and had gotten a furlough to go home to Arlington for Thanksgiving weekend during the murder of Sue Tucker. The next morning, Horgus met the Williams boys and their lieutenant for breakfast at a hotel restaurant in Fredericksburg and laid it all out for them. Because they didn't have any direct evidence like fingerprints linking Spencer to the crimes, Horgus's commanding officer and the Commonwealth's attorney wouldn't approve an arrest. But Spencer was scheduled to travel back to Arlington that coming weekend, and Horgus needed Richmond police to coordinate surveillance with Arlington detectives. If they could catch Spencer in the act of breaking into a house or doing something else illegal, they could take him into custody. That made Arlington prosecutor Helen Fahey nervous, though. What if they lost sight of him? What if he broke into a house and killed someone before the police could arrest him?
Well, surveillance always sounds much better in the books than it does in real life. To actually do a full surveillance of anyone takes a tremendous number of people. And it's still very, very difficult. And I said, once he gets away, suppose you lose him. And tomorrow morning you find out that some other woman was murdered a half a block away. They managed to get the Richmond police somewhat interested in some surveillance down there. But they didn't want to do it because they didn't think it was the guy. And
due to an unexpected snowstorm, Spencer ended up not traveling to Arlington, and Richmond police reluctantly began their surveillance. Within the first few days, Spencer was pulled over by police while driving a borrowed car. It was a clear violation of his parole. He had his girlfriend and one of her friends with him. The two women were suspected of shoplifting from Cloverleaf Mall and a local grocery store. Ray had radioed the officer who pulled Spencer over and told him to let Spencer go with a warning. But after the police car pulled away, the plainclothes officers who were tailing Spencer saw him do something strange. He crawled under the car, lying on his back in 3 inches of snow, searching the car's undercarriage. I heard he got under his car and started looking for bugs under the car in the snow.
We checked it every night. Yeah, we attached it to the inside bumper.
Oh, you actually did have a tracker on the car?
Yeah, yeah.
And he never found it? But he would go under looking for
Yeah,
it.
he looked for it every time he come out.
Had you ever seen a suspect do that under surveillance? Never.
No.
During the 2 weeks that Richmond undercover officers kept Spencer under surveillance, he sometimes spent the night at his girlfriend's house in Church Hill. This was despite the fact that he was supposed to be living at the halfway house as a condition of his parole. The officers also observed Spencer hanging out for hours at a time at Cloverleaf Mall, which had strong links to all 3 Richmond area strangler victims. It was an intriguing clue, Ray says, but police never saw Timothy Spencer do anything overtly incriminating. And after 2 weeks without being able to directly connect him to the South Side Strangler killings, Ray's bosses told him they were pulling the surveillance. It was taking too much manpower. Joe Horgus and Helen Fahey were horrified.
They watch him for a week, they surveil him for a week, and they let him know, we don't think this is the right guy, so we're dropping the surveillance. Well, Helen panicked, and we had a big meeting.
As an elected office holder, Helen Fahey knew that it could be seriously embarrassing to her as the county prosecutor if they arrested Spencer and couldn't prove he committed the crimes. Or worse yet, if Spencer turned out not to be the killer after all. But wasn't the public safety worth that risk?
The choice was, do you take the chance on leaving someone you believe is a serial murderer on the street? What do we do? It appears that Timothy Spencer is a very, very dangerous serial murderer, rapist. And from the time that he got out of the penitentiary in '87, in a little over 2 months, he had murdered and raped, 3 women and 1 teenage girl. And looking at that, it was pretty clear that as long as he was out there, there were going to be more of these murders.
So she and Horgus took a gamble. Assembling all the information they had compiled on Spencer, they presented their case before the Arlington County Grand Jury. On Wednesday, January 20th, 1988, the grand jury returned indictments against Timothy Spencer for rape, murder, and burglary in the killing of Sue Tucker. Horgus called the shocked Ray and Glenn Williams to tell them to get ready because he was coming down to Richmond to arrest Timothy Spencer. But before he drove down to Richmond, Horgus stopped at Timothy Spencer's mother's home in Arlington's Green Valley neighborhood. Her humble row house was right next to the site of the first masked rapist attack, and about a 10-minute walk from the home of murder victim Sue Tucker. Speaking with Spencer's mother and grandmother, Horgus told them he wanted to search the house for stolen goods in connection with a break-in over the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. The suspect's mother told him that she couldn't remember if Timothy had been home for Thanksgiving, but he definitely came home for Christmas because he had given her a Christmas gift of some glassware. She had insisted on getting a receipt from Timothy, she told Horgus sadly, because she wanted to ensure that the gift hadn't been stolen. Horgus searched the house, but he couldn't find anything connected to the Arlington crimes. Later that afternoon, Horgus, the Williams boys, and a large team of plainclothes officers assembled outside the Hospitality House on Porter Street in South Richmond. The halfway house for paroled felons was 2 miles from the apartment where Debbie Davis had been strangled to death, and barely a mile from Dr. Susan Hellam's house. Both murder sites were easily walkable via main roads. They were waiting for Spencer to return from his job about 25 minutes away. They knew he was due back to the halfway house for a mandatory group meeting at around 6 p.m. When Timothy Spencer pulled up in a brown Chevrolet sedan at around 10 minutes to 6, he had no idea he was surrounded.
And I don't even know how many people were involved, but I know we were outside the halfway house waiting for him to come home. And when he comes home, short story is, he walks into the halfway house, he's checking in, and about the same time he's checking in, we're there to arrest him. Now I didn't tell him he was under arrest for murder. I told him he was under arrest for burglary, because burglary was one of the indictments.
Spencer was a light-skinned young African-American man, handsome, with hazel eyes and a neatly trimmed haircut. He was average height, on the thin side, but athletic-looking. Far from appearing evil or menacing, he was quiet and looked shocked. Presented with the arrest warrant, Spencer was told his bond was $350,000. For a burglary? Spencer asked with astonishment. He looked around at all the policemen who'd been sent to arrest him. Geez, I don't know why the judge did that, Horkus claimed innocently. Searching Spencer's room in the halfway house, Horkus and the other officers found a wool stocking cap and a pair of winter gloves. They also found 2 long, sturdy screwdrivers, the type favored by burglars for breaking into houses. Spencer had a folding hunting knife and a box of .25 caliber ammo, both parole violations. Police found no trophies or stolen objects from the murder scenes. When they flipped over the bedroom mattress, Horkus spotted a large, roughly drawn figure 8 or infinity sign scrawled across the bottom of the mattress in marker. Joe called Glenn over and asked if it looked to him like the same symbol that had been painted with nail polish on Diane Cho's thigh. Jesus, Glenn replied. Seems like it. Asked if he had drawn it, Spencer said he'd never seen it before. Spencer's bedroom in the halfway house was room number 8. Southern Nightmare will return after this word from Audible. Hey Southern Nightmare listeners, you're going to love this special offer from Audible. They're offering you a free audiobook download of your choice to keep with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. They've got over 180,000 titles to choose from, pretty much anything you can think of, from classics to the latest bestsellers. You can listen on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. I'm an Audible subscriber, and right now I'm listening to I'll Be Gone in the Dark, One Woman's Obsessive Search for the Golden State Killer by Michelle McNamara. It's true crime at its best. I highly recommend it. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Southern Nightmare. Again, that's audibletrial, AUDIBLE, trial.com/Southern Nightmare for your free audiobook. In the car on the return trip to Arlington, Horkus sat in the back seat of the police car with the handcuffed Spencer. That's when he told Spencer that they were going to need to get a blood sample from him. Spencer thought for a second and asked, "Does this involve a rape?" "Why?" Horkus asked. "Well, you only want blood if there's a rape," Spencer said. "No," Horkus told him. "A lot of burglars cut themselves when they break windows." Spencer's response? "Well, I didn't cut myself."
Spencer didn't think they could get his... He knew he didn't cut himself. So that's why he didn't hesitate on giving his blood.
While they were driving to Arlington, Spencer asked where the burglary he was being arrested for occurred. Horkus told him Fairlington Villages. Then Spencer asked, "Does this have anything to do with the murder?" "Why are you asking out that?" Horkus said. "I live close to Fairlington," Spencer said. "I read the papers and everything. I know what's going on up there." When they returned to Arlington, the police obtained a sample of Spencer's blood, and Horkus began interrogating Spencer. The FBI profilers told Horkus that he should start by seeing if he could get Spencer to confess to burglary, because serial killers seldom confess to murders. But Spencer already knew he was suspected for Sue Tucker's murder, and despite Joe Horkus's best efforts, he wouldn't admit to anything. When Horkus told Spencer that he had slipped up by leaving his sperm at the murder scene, Spencer shot back, "Well, you ain't got my sperm."
He was kind of smug. I mean, believe me, I worked on him. Most of my cases I get confessions. I didn't get one in this case. Richmond come up and they worked on him. A couple of days later, I remember they came up to talk to him. They didn't get anywhere with him.
The only time Spencer seemed rattled was when he was shown photos of the hideously decomposing body of Sue Tucker. At that moment, he seemed fully aware of the seriousness of what was happening and blurted out, "I didn't do this. This is bad, real bad. I know somebody's out to get my ass if they say I did some shit like that. You're all looking at me like I have two sides, like I'm some kind of Jack the Ripper or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, like I turn into a mutant killer or something like that. There ain't nothing wrong with me. I had nothing to do with this murder."
I mean, he just denied everything. There was no getting through to him.
Some of that may have been due to the fact that even though he was only 25 years old, Spencer was already a savvy, hardened criminal who had served 2 stretches in prison for burglary. And some of the reason may have been cultural, according to retired FBI profiler Judson Ray.
Growing up in the South, black boys are not, sometimes they even taught not to be verbal talking to white people. Well, the cops are what, you know? Not that they're trying to hide anything, it's just that the socialization.
With Spencer in custody and a sample of his blood now obtained, it was just a matter of playing the waiting game. Without any witnesses or fingerprints, there was only one way they were going to be able to prove that Timothy Spencer was the South Side Strangler, through a new process called DNA fingerprinting.
The whole idea of DNA was just sort of starting to percolate, and none of us knew much about it. But we finally focused in on the fact that if we could get a sample from Spencer and it matched, his DNA matched the crime scenes, then we'd have good, solid evidence.
Back in September 1987, around the same time that Debbie Davis was murdered, a private DNA testing lab in New York called Life Codes approached Dr. Paul Ferrara, the director of Virginia's Forensic Science Testing Lab. At that time, DNA testing was a new technology, less than 10 years old, and it was primarily being used in paternity testing. But DNA fingerprinting had been used successfully in a U.S. rape trial and in a murder case in Europe, and Life Codes was now eager to prove to Virginia that they could use it to solve tough cases like the South Side Strangler serial killings. Ferrara fully understood the possibilities and began working with Life Codes immediately. Richmond police sent semen samples collected at the Davis and Helms murders to Life Codes for analysis, and the lab confirmed that Debbie Davis and Dr. Susan Helms had both been killed by the same man. In late December, Joe Horgus had personally flown to Life Codes headquarters in New York to hand-deliver semen samples collected from the murders of Carolyn Hom and Sue Tucker, as well as some of the 1983 and 1984 masked rapist cases. He flew back to Life Codes in late January to deliver the samples of Timothy Spencer's blood. In those early days of DNA analysis, it would take anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks to get the results back. One of the case's investigators would never find out if Spencer's DNA had been a match, however. By early February 1988, Richmond homicide detective Glenn Williams was getting even more withdrawn, and Ray Williams knew something was seriously wrong with his partner.
He was real distant with me. So I was scheduled to work evening shift on February 3rd, coming in at 4, get off at 12 or whatever. Well, I came in at 2 for some reason. He was sitting at his desk. He said, "I'm going hurt." I said, "I'll ride with you." He said, "I don't want anybody ride with me. Nobody ride with me ever again." Left the office. I went to Sergeant Harding. I said, "Glenn's in trouble." He went to Glenn, and Glenn wouldn't talk about it. Stuart Cook called me the night of February 3rd. I said, he said, "I need to meet with you. Where are you?" I said, "I'm at Cloverleaf Mall." He said, "Well, stay there." It was 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And I said, "Oh, I wonder what I did." Deputy Chief called me. See, we met. He says, "Glenn just shot himself, and he's dead." He said, "Take me to his house." I couldn't think. We had to get Chesterfield to meet us because my mind shut down. I couldn't tell you how to get to Glenn's house. I've probably been there 30 times. But yeah, he's a great guy.
What Glenn hadn't been telling Ray was that at the same time that Glenn was becoming more and more disturbed by the South Side Strangler killings, his marriage had also been falling apart. Glenn shot himself in the chest at point-blank range with his own 9mm handgun shortly after an argument with his wife in their suburban Chesterfield County home. He was 38 years old. The Williams boys' partnership had come to an end.
Well, he was lying in bed and watching Hee-Haw on TV. And they got into this argument, whatever. He walked over, got the gun under the drawer, and put it through his heart, and boom. He internalized a lot of stuff. I told Sergeant Harding, I said, "Glenn don't talk to me." I said, "Something's going on. I'm not sure what it is." But cops are famous for killing themselves. Now, Glenn had dated his wife since high school. And I'm sure that was a contributing factor. But this stuff really got on Glenn's nerve. But I knew probably the last 2 weeks before he killed himself, very distant. Looking in his eyes like looking into emptiness. And the sad part is, the news came out today after he committed suicide and said homicide detective Williams committed suicide in the city. Well, my ex-wife and 2 daughters heard it on the TV and called me and, what's his suicide? I said, it's Glenn. My wife said, I knew it would be you. You're too damn stubborn. But yeah, Glenn was a great guy.
Richmond Police Major V. Stuart Cook was quoted in the local paper saying that Glenn was one of the most energetic and dedicated investigators we had. With all the tragedy he saw, experienced, and investigated, he never lost his sensitivity toward his victims. He never allowed the job to harden him. Glenn's suicide surprised everyone who had met him during the South Side Strangler investigation. Dr. Ronald Hayes says he never saw any sign of anything wrong with Glenn when he was investigating the murder of Rena Chapouris just weeks earlier.
It was just one more shock in what seemed to be, an ever constricting circle of death that surrounded us all. These were even more innocent times. This was unprecedented. This wasn't an age when high school students were offing each other every week. This was a different age.
Meanwhile, Joe Horgus was calling life codes almost every day to see if there was anything new to report on the DNA results. On Wednesday, March 16, 1988, there was. Dr. Michael Baird, who was the director of life codes, remembers that moment well.
And I'll never forget when we did the testing on these 2 purportedly unrelated cases, we came up with the same DNA profile.
Life Codes forensic scientist Lisa Bennett called Horgus with the news. She had matched Timothy Spencer's DNA to DNA collected from semen on a sleeping bag and a pink nightgown at the Sue Tucker murder scene. Bennett had also been able to match Spencer's DNA to a semen stain from a bathrobe in one of the 1983 masked rapist attacks. The only bad piece of news was that Life Codes was unable to extract DNA from a semen-stained robe found at the Carolyn Hamm murder scene. Bennett had one other piece of news for Joe Horgus, too. Life Codes had also matched Spencer's DNA to semen samples from the murders of Debbie Davis and Dr. Susan Helms, as well as the Richmond woman who had been raped and tied up by a masked intruder. Timothy Spencer was the South Side Strangler. Life Code scientists calculated the odds of an unrelated African-American male sharing the same sequences of genetic markers at 1 in 135 million. At the time, the entire African-American population of the United States was only about 28 million.
The day she called me and says it's a match, I definitely remember that day. Of course, the first person I went to was Helen Fahey, let her know it was a match. I got a kiss from her.
It was a groundbreaking moment for both science and American law enforcement, says Dr. Lawrence Kablinski, a professor of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York.
This was the first killing that was solved through DNA analysis. So it's a very important case in the history of DNA.
Ken Melson, former acting director of the ATF, is also a past president of the Academy of Forensic Sciences. He teaches courses on forensic science at the George Washington University Law School and is very familiar with the South Side Strangler case.
So it really established the fact that DNA was a useful tool for connecting a suspect to a particular crime. And that really set the stage for the use of DNA around the country, not only for pinpointing suspects or defendants in a particular case and connecting them to the crime, but it established other precedents as well. What that did was really catapult DNA into the forensic field in law enforcement. So it was a tremendous advancement in forensic science.
For Arlington prosecutor Helen Fahey, though, the historic DNA match was just the beginning. she still would need to convince 12 jurors that this new DNA science that they'd never even heard of was accurate enough to convict a man for capital murder, in a case without any fingerprints, witnesses, or other physical evidence connecting Timothy Spencer to the crime.
The whole trial came down to whether or not the jury would accept the DNA as evidence. Because if they didn't, they were going to acquit him because they had no other evidence to rely on.
Next time on Southern Nightmare.
You heard holsters unsnap. The judge took a dive, and I said, whatever you do, do not move. And I'm telling you, the people in the courtroom screamed. It was bizarro.
Southern Nightmare is a production of True South Media in cooperation with Style Weekly Magazine and WRIR 97.3 FM Richmond Independent Radio. New episodes are released every Tuesday. It's recorded at Sound of Music Recording Studios in Richmond, Virginia. Our producer is John Morand. Original music by Daniel Davis. For exclusive extra web content, visit our website at southernnightmare.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to leave a positive review on iTunes. It helps people find us. We'd like to give special thanks to everyone who gave their time to talk with us for this podcast and to you for listening. Pleasant dreams.